All right. Hello, friends. I'm here with my friend Maria Lucas. Maria and I have been friends for a long time. And today, on this day in history, Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, the first Indigenous person to be canonized, died on this date in history. And so I thought I would invite my good friend Maria, who of all the friends I know has the greatest passion for Saint Kateri, to talk a little bit about Saint Kateri's life and then to touch on St. Kateri's death, and also on the legacy of this Indigenous Catholic saint. And my friends will know that I have a passion for Jewish Catholic relations and for Jewish identity and Catholic identity. And like me, Maria does the tough work of grappling with distinct and yet complementary identities, as she seeks to do with the Indigenous and Catholic identities that she straddles. So welcome, Maria, and thank you for joining me on St. Kateri's feast day.
Thank you for inviting me, Amanda. I'm happy to be here and to talk with you about this really important topic that's near and dear to my heart.
All right, so in case some people have never heard of St. Kateri before, who was she? Why does she matter? And why does she enliven and animate your life so much?
Yes, so Saint Kateri was a Algonquin Mohawk woman who lived in the mid 1600s, I should say. And she died at the age of 24 years old. Um, and she lived a remarkable 24 years. And she inspires me and enlivens my life because she is such an inspiration in terms of the virtue that she lived, in terms of the friendship that she cultivated throughout her life. Just the way she loved uh, is so inspirational and is something that I look to as an example. And she is someone who was able to converge or integrate the identities of being an Indigenous woman and a Catholic woman, and was able to show that those two things are not incongruent or irreconcilable, but that they're actually quite complementary.
So what were some ways that she did that? How did she navigate that? I'm sure there were a lot of difficulties in her context. What were some of those obstacles? And then how did she find her way?
Yeah, so she was give it a little bit of a background. So she was orphaned at about 6 or 7 years old. Her parents died, unfortunately, and she was adopted into her broader family within her Mohawk community. And she, at a very young age, was got sick with smallpox, and she eventually recovered, but she was frail and ill for a lot of her life as a result. And she was still very much scarred from the disease. Um, so, but she persevered regardless. And when the Jesuits came to uh, evangelize to the Mohawk, she came across one and um, was interested to know more about what the Jesuits had to bring um, to the Mohawk community, to her sort of context. And so she got asked more questions, and she got more interested. She eventually expressed a desire to be baptized. And it was interesting at the time because the Jesuit who was giving her instruction actually told her to wait a little while because he wanted to ensure that she was really doing it out of her own free will, out of her own choice, and that she wasn't being swayed by anything. Because at the time, given the political context, sometimes if you were Catholic, it would prove for better trading relations with the French, for example. So the Jesuits were very concerned about people converting for the wrong reasons, basically. So when she had converted, at her baptism, the record shows that initially her community was very supportive. Like both Christian and non-Christian Mohawks attended her baptism, and really respected her choice. But the implications of her choice also meant that she wouldn't work on Sundays, for example. And that sometimes caused a bit of a rift because work needed to be done, like the community needed to keep moving, right? So that would sometimes cause some tension within her family relationships. She also had a desire to remain celibate in her life, but her family wanted her to get married, and she would refuse. She didn't want. She not that she necessarily didn't want to. I'm sure, like being a human being, that's a natural desire, but she didn't feel that that was her call. So, and once again, celibacy being, even to this day, a very hard concept for our modern society to wrap our heads around. It wasn't any different then. So those are some of the tensions that she was experiencing personally, and also within the community. Christianity had caused a bit of a divide amongst families, causing some Mohawk to move away from their community and to Kanawaki, which was a Christian Mohawk community just outside of Montreal, or what eventually became Montreal. So there was some deep emotional pain as well. And she was sort of having to navigate that within her community. And she eventually decided to move to Kanawaki, which was the Mohawk Christian community, which couldn't have been an easy choice, right? Because while I'm sure she loved God and her faith, she also loved her family. So the animosity that she experienced from her family, any persecution, as sometimes the historical record shows, it doesn't necessarily mean it was out of a place of hatred, but just hurt and anger.
So those were some of the obstacles and antagonisms. What were some of the ways that she, upon embracing the Catholic faith and becoming interested in it, found means of integration or found crossover between the Indigenous ways of life and the ways that she found in the life of the church?
Yeah, so from what I can remember, from the research, and oh yeah, so that's more context. I had written a paper on her a number of years ago now.
Which was a great paper that I read the several years ago that you wrote it.
Yeah, uh, on this very topic, right? On this conversion of Indigenous and Catholic or Christian identity, specifically Catholic in her case. And it explored this. It explored how she was able to do this, how her Mohawk identity would have informed her conversion. So there were certain things that are present in the Catholic tradition that I argued that she would have been able to identify with because she was coming from her Mohawk context. So things like ascetical practices, which, for those who may not know what asceticism means, it's like corporal mortifications. So the historical record shows that for the Mohawk, they practice those mortifications within certain contexts. Sometimes in preparation for war, the men would practice corporal mortifications.
To toughen themselves up, to sort of make themselves
Pardon?
to toughen themselves up and to make them resilient. What were the sort of indigenous means of these sort of practices, and then how did
Yeah.
they have a crossover or convergence with the Christian kind of spirit toward them?
So I think, like in the Christian tradition, right, we practice asceticism not necessarily to toughen ourselves up, yes, but it's to toughen ourselves up for a spiritual battle, right? For spiritual warfare, not actual warfare. Um, so there's that parallel there, right? And that's something that she likely would have understood, because to live one's Christian life well or as best as you can, it requires an interior fight, right? And that's what mortification helps us to do. It prepares us for that fight. Um, so that was one thing that she would have been able to see and to identify with. One practice that I also remember, and it's one that made a lot of sense for me, being both Catholic and Indigenous, was the incense, which is something that we still have within the Catholic Church, right? We use the incense to sort of purify our space, especially during adoration when the Holy Eucharist is exposed. And the smoke from the incense is sort of a symbolic representation of our prayers raising to heaven. And in the Indigenous tradition of smudging, it's very similar. Usually with smudging, you'll burn a sacred medicine like sage, and you'll cleanse yourself with the smoke from the sage. So it'll be your hands and your eyes and your head and your ears, and it's just and as you do so, you say a prayer to the Creator for whatever your intentions are. For me, it's I generally say something along the lines of, today help me to do your work with my hands, help me to speak your word with my mouth, help me to see people in the world through your eyes, right? And those intentions are then brought up to the Creator with the smoke. So it's not, again, another practice that isn't incongruous with Christianity, but something that's quite parallel and something that she would have identified with more than likely.
Okay, that's good. So let's jump forward to her death. Her death happened pretty early in her life, and it was during a time of a smallpox epidemic. And so she found a way to sort of path to sanctity during an epidemic, which might be having some exemplary lessons for us today. What was it about how she approached her death and how she died that contributed to her sanctity and contributes to her legacy as a saint?
Yeah, so she converted to Christianity at the age of 20, and she died at the age of 24, right? So she was only officially a Christian for 4 years, but she had lived, and my argument was that she had lived an exemplary life all those 24 years. It wasn't just like at 20 that she then decided to, try to strive for sanctity and holiness, but that she came from a context that very much enabled that journey. So when it came to her death, she faced it with a lot of composure, a lot of peace, a lot of solitude, and just immense faith and trust in the everlasting life, right? In eternity, and knowing where she was going. And I had mentioned earlier that she, at a very young age, got sick with smallpox and was frail all her life. So she would often be sick. So she had experienced much suffering in her life to that point, and yet she was able to still face her death with a lot of peace, which is very inspiring. And so when she had died, she actually died in the arms of her best friend, who is Marie Therese, or one of her best friends. And she had said to her upon her death, to leave her with peace, she had said, and I'm just going to quote from the paper I wrote about 10 years ago, it feels like. She says, I am about to die. Always remember what we have done together since we knew each other. I will love you in heaven. I will pray for you. I will assist you. And I think that was really just to help, even though Marie Therese herself was Christian, we all still reel from death, right? We all still feel the pain when someone dies. I once heard that death doesn't really affect the person who dies, it affects everyone else around them, right? And so they would have felt the loss, they would have felt that pain still, even if they had believed in an everlasting life and eternity on a very human level. You love that person, right? And that's something that Saint Kateri really understood. And I think she wanted to leave her friends and family with the peace of knowing that she was going to a better place. All right, she really believed that, and that they didn't have to worry, but that they could be happy for her, and they could sort of rest in that truth.
That's beautiful. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I think it really shows a generosity of spirit to be able to be approaching death and at the same time concerned so much for your loved ones, for their experience and how they're doing. And that level of attention shows her sort of self-emptying and self-gift,
Mm-hmm.
even unto death kind of thing. So that's really good. On a sort of very last note, what in your day-to-day, it's been a while since you studied Saint Kateri formally,
Mm-hmm.
and yet she still obviously makes you light up, and you still have a lot of devotion to her. So just in a couple seconds, what would you say is your ongoing takeaway as far as living the Indigenous and Catholic identity from her?
um, wow, yeah, that was a big question. I think for me personally, my journey has not been easy, right? Like, you look at the history of church Indigenous relations, and it's very easy, and for good reason, to be like, no, like, this is not what happened, isn't right. How could that have happened? And when I say that, I'm referring to the history of colonization, residential schools, violent assimilation, um, all things that are like the antithesis of what Christianity stands for. Um, a lack of respect for freedom, a lack of respect for human dignity, a lack of respect for self-determination. When Christianity at its core does not stand for that. And so I think what Saint Kateri, what her life and her example shows, um, is that this is Christianity choosing to follow Christ is a free choice. It's not something that can be forced, and that when it is chosen, it's chosen from a place of love. Um, and she sort of helps, I think, particularly Indigenous youth, because she was so young herself, to sort of wrestle with these questions, these very real existential questions as a result of this history of who am I and what does it mean to be Indigenous and Catholic. And she exemplifies that. This is what it means. This is what it looks like. She gives us that very tangible, real example for us to follow. And that's why she's been such an inspiration in my life, and that's why she's been truly remarkable. and and I think that's really her legacy. Is she helps us to heal that split that we sometimes feel at the center of ourselves because of the history that came before us.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on her feast day, and God bless.
Thank you.